Hello, my name is Larry Dennis, and I'm going to do a presentation for my epistemology class at Holy Apostles. The title of my presentation is What is Skepticism in Epistemology? So, what is skepticism? And by the way, skepticism can be spelled with a K or a C, they mean the same thing. Skepticism is a word derived from ancient Greek, but it has since become part of our English language. To be skeptical about something means to have doubt. Examples of this would be doubting how successful a church fundraiser was, or doubting what is said in a priest homily. This use of the word goes back to Descartes in the 17th century, who used some of the arguments of the ancient skeptics in his famous method of doubting everything that could possibly be doubted. The noun skeptic literally means inquirer. Ancient philosophers, who we call skeptics, were primarily known for the usual result of their inquiries, mostly their suspension of judgment. The term skepticism designates a variety of approaches to philosophical problems. A skeptic is a person who hesitates or refuses to accept the truth of propositions. Skepticism may be a mere psychological attitude or a deliberate doctrine. It may be systematic or unsystematic, partial or total. Philosophical skepticism usually suggests more than mere caution or a willingness to examine problems. Skepticism has become associated with doubt, an inability to form one's judgment. As a result, doubt is the skeptic's characteristic reaction in the face of theoretical problems. The varieties of skepticism. Skepticism is not one specific view. It is composed of a wide variety of views. There are so many different views of skepticism that it would take a whole book to discuss all of them. So I will just highlight some of the different views. One of the views is that skepticism must question either A, the existence of a belief of the relevant sort, or B, the truth of that belief, or C, the adequacy of its justification. Of these possibilities, a skeptical challenge to the very existence of the relevant belief is relatively uncommon. In Lawrence Bonjour's book titled Epistemology, Classic Problems and Contemporary Responses, Bonjour says a challenge directed at truth is certainly possible, but if such a challenge is argued for on grounds independent of issues about the justification of the beliefs in question, it will be metaphysical rather than epistemological in character. Bonjour suggests the only very clear epistemological basis on which to challenge a claim of knowledge is to question the adequacy of the justification of the belief in question. Another way to look at this is to question whether the believer in question has a sufficiently good reason for thinking that the belief is true. The most easily understood version of skepticism are those that focus on justification. Another differing view is the scope of the skeptical challenge. Does it challenge the justification of all or almost all beliefs, or does it focus on beliefs in some smaller category? Another view of skepticism is the strength of the skeptical claim or challenge. There are two extreme ends to this view. The first is the weak claim that the beliefs in question are not conclusively justified. That is not so strongly justified as to rule out any possibility of error. At the other end of the spectrum are versions of skepticism that advance the very strong claim that the belief or beliefs in question are not justified to any serious degree at all, that there is no good reason of any sort for thinking them to be true. Skeptical views that fall between these two extremes are skeptical views that are challenging and interesting. The history of skepticism lies in three sections. Its foundations were laid by the Greeks. It was revived in the medieval and Renaissance periods, and it emerged as a philosophical system during the early development of modern philosophy. According to ancient tradition, skepticism began with Philo of Elis, who is famous because of his lifestyle and his calm composure. He explained his attitude by claiming that there is no way of finding out whether any belief about the world around us is either true or false. Philo did not write anything himself, but his student and admirer, Timon of Philis, wrote accounts praising Philo's life and teaching, even though only fragments of Timon's writings survive. One of his writings starts and finishes referring to happiness and tranquility, the state of mind of a happy person. It discusses Philo's prescription for a happy life that is based on an epistemological argument indicated only by its conclusion that neither our senses nor our judgments are either true or false. Behind this conclusion stands the old argument from conflicting appearances. Our senses present us with contradictory evidence about their objects. A swimming pool may be cold to one person and warm to another. A candy could be sweet for me and sour for you. Philosophers used examples like this to denounce the unreliability of the senses as sources of information. During Philo's time, this same time of conflict could be noticed in the constant disputes among philosophers who claimed to rely on reason and argument rather than perception. Philo saw no way of resolving these conflicts. His followers believed that both sides in each controversy have the same authority. Arguments on both sides have the same strength, so there is no reason to prefer one view over another. The outcome of giving up on any attempt to find the truth was then supposed to lead someone to Philo's attitude of indifference to all questions, which would eventually lead to tranquility. Stoics. The academic Stoic debate was conducted mainly in terms of sense impressions. Academics gave two types of examples, very similar kinds of objects and conditions in which one's judgment would be impaired. In the first group, they started with examples of coins from the same mint or imprints from the same seal, as well as eggs from the same farm. The Stoics would recognize that things of these sorts could not easily be distinguished, but they insisted that even these were in principle distinguishable, as shown by the alleged example of a poultry farmer who could tell the difference between two eggs laid by the same hen. A Stoic that did not have the farmer's expertise would simply suspend judgment in such a case. The Stoics defended their view by appealing to the principle that no two different things can be indiscernible. They also maintained that cognitive impressions tended to be so clear and distinct that it was practically impossible to resist assenting to them. This led them to the second kind of counterexamples, dreamers and madmen. People who dream or are mentally ill will often become crazy and doubtful things in their dreams, will often believe crazy and doubtful things in their dreams, excuse me. They may see a family member who passed away a long time ago. Stoics insisted that the impressions of dreamers and madmen were definitely different from those who are mentally stable or awake. Dreamers can easily recognize their errors when they get up, and madmen can do the same once they are medicated and thinking properly. Medieval and Renaissance skeptics. Medieval skeptics tended to undervalue the capabilities of unaided reason. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, doubt was thrown on the validity of rational proofs of God's existence and similar matters. Optimists, like John of Mycroft, judged propositions such as God's existence and the casual dependence of creatures to be incapable of demonstrative proof. His philosophy is a form of probabilism. Nicholas of Autrecourt, also an optimist, denied the possibility of inferring the existence of one thing from that of another. He also invoked the well-known skeptical argument of the future adversary, which is thought that some future thinker may be able to refute what one now considers to be irrefutable, to urge caution regarding his own probable theories. Renaissance skeptics. A number of factors contributed to the rise of skepticism in the Renaissance. One of the factors was the Reformation, with its challenge to the traditional criteria of religious and philosophical truth. The revival of interest in ancient literature, the rediscovery and translation of the works of Sextus Empiricus, and the invention of printing. Pyrrhonian and academic doubt became popular from the beginning of the 14th century to the advent of modern philosophy, though few proponents of skepticism fully adopted the radical principles of their ancient models. I will talk about some of them. Nicholas of Cusa, who lived from 1401 till 1464, was an anti-Aristotelian. His work, called Learned Ignorance, presented wisdom as consisting in a recognition of one's own ignorance. Desiderius Erasmus put forth a form of fideistic skepticism as a basis for remaining within the Catholic Church. Cornelius Agrippa of Nedosium, who lived from 1468 to 1534, was a German philosopher who included the French humanist Montaigne and wrote a book that asserted nothing is more damaging to human salvation than the arts and sciences. His skepticism, like most Renaissance skeptics, was fideistic in nature. He likened knowledge to the serpent of the Garden of Eden. Revelation offers the sole means of overcoming the handicap arising from original sin. The last Renaissance skeptic I will talk about is Francisco Sanchez, who, like me, was Portuguese. He was a philosopher and doctor. In 1581, he published a book. All of his writings ended with the question quid, which meant that when all is said, the basic question still remains unanswered. The more I think, the more I doubt. What can I say, he asked, that is not open to suspicion? For to me, all human affairs are suspect, even the very things I write at this moment. God alone knows all. Hence, faith and the Holy Scriptures must be set apart from the things to be doubted. This is proof that Sanchez follows the fideistic pattern of Renaissance skepticism. We will now move on to modern skepticism. Modern skepticism emerged partly from Ockhamite medieval views, but its main source was the rediscovery of the skeptical classics. Not much of the Pyrrhonian tradition had been known in the Middle Ages, but in the 15th century, the texts of Sextus Empiricus in Greek were brought from the Byzantine Empire into Italy. Interest in Cicero was also revived, and some of his works were published in the 16th century. The following happened and undermined the confidence in widely accepted religious practices: voyages of exploration, the humanistic rediscovery of the learning of ancient Greek, Rome and Palestine, as well as the new science. During the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the doctrinal controversies between Protestants and Roman Catholics brought forth fundamental epistemological issues about the basis and criteria of religious knowledge. The Reformation. In the 15th century, scholars in the Florentine convent located in San Marco reviewed the views of Sextus in manuscripts located there. Monks translated Sextus into Latin in order to see the vanity of all pagan philosophy. Unfortunately, they were never able to finish because their leader, Savonarola, was tried and executed as a heretic. Gianfresco Pico, one of his disciples, published Examen Vanitas in 1520. This was the first work to use skepticism as a means of challenging the whole of philosophy. It was also the first time Sextus was discussed in Latin for a European audience. Skeptical arguments were central to the 16th century debate between Martin Luther and Erasmus. Erasmus used academic skeptical writings and insisted that the issues in dispute could not be resolved, and as a result, one should suspend judgment and remain within the Roman Catholic Church. On the flip side, Luther insisted that true and certain religious knowledge could and must be gained through conscience. The view of Erasmus turned into a form of Christian skepticism that accepted traditional Christianity on faith. Luther's view proposed a new criterion: inner experience. While that was going on, the Catholics of the Counter-Reformation employed Pyrrhonian and academic arguments in an attempt to undermine Luther's criterion. H.C. Agrippa von Nettesium, a stormy occult philosopher and physician, employed skeptical arguments against scholasticism, Renaissance naturalism, and a lot of other views in order to bring people over from Roman Catholicism, the true religion. In a similar fashion, Gentian Herbert, a Catholic scholar, saw skeptical arguments as the definitive answer to Calvinism and the way to true Christianity. In 1576, Montague and Sanchez explored the human epistemological situation and showed that knowledge claims in all areas were very doubtful. Montague recommended living according to nature and custom and accepting whatever God revealed. Sanchez, on the other hand, advocated recognizing that nothing can be known and then trying to gain what limited information one can through empirical, scientific means. The 17th century. Montaigne's skepticism was very popular in the early 17th century. He had followers in France, including Pierre Charon, J.P. Chamis, and Lamotte Leverrier, who made his view even more well known. French counter-reformers used the arguments of Montaigne and Sextus to undermine Calvinism. Montaigne's skepticism opposed a variety of disciplines, which included the new science. René Descartes had a refutation of the new skepticism, asserting that by applying the skeptical method of doubting all beliefs that could possibly be false, one would discover a truth that is impossible to doubt. John Locke was also a popular philosopher in the 17th century. He and other English philosophers tried to direct the force of skepticism by appealing to common sense and to the reasonable person's inability to doubt everything. They acknowledged that there might not be sufficient evidence to support knowledge claims extending beyond immediate experience. However, this did not actually mean that everything had to be doubted. By using standards and basis for many found, Pascal brought forth the case for skepticism and publishing that the knowledge could be a skepticism because nature prevents it. He thought humans must turn to God in overcoming. At the end of the 19th century, Pierre Bayle argued that the theories of Descartes and others casting down all beliefs about the world, even the beliefs that exist. Bayle imposed skeptical arguments about things as information, human logical explanation, and the criteria of knowledge in order to undermine confidence in human intellectual activity all areas. Humans should abandon rational activity and turn to faith and revelation. If they did that, they can only follow their conscience without any measure for determining true faith. Bayle taught that the different conceptions of religious knowledge were so questionable that even views like atheism made more sense, and because of this, his work became very popular in the 18th century, and he was viewed as a major enemy of religion. The 18th century. Bayle's 18th century successor was David Hume. He combined empirical and skeptical arguments and argued that neither inductive nor deductive evidence could establish the truth of any matter of fact. He taught that knowledge can consist of obvious matters, but not of anything beyond experience. The mind can discover no necessary connections within experience, and it also cannot discover root causes of experience. Beliefs about the world are based only on habit and custom, not upon real evidence. French philosopher and mathematician Condorcet, who lived from 1743 to 1794, believed that mathematics, physics, and moral philosophies were all probable. He also brought up the possibility that the mental faculties of which people judge their knowledge might change over time, and as a result, what is judged true today might not be judged true in the future. Hume's skeptical analysis of the basis of induction and causality, knowledge of the external world and the self, proofs of the existence of God, became key issues of philosophy that followed. Thomas Reid hoped to reboot Hume's skepticism by exposing it as a logical conclusion on the basic assumptions of modern philosophy from Descartes onward. He urged that these assumptions should be abandoned for commonsensical principles that have to be believed. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, realized that Hume had brought forth a fundamental challenge to all human knowledge claims. To respond to Hume, he had to prove not that knowledge is possible, but how knowledge is possible. Kant combined the skepticism toward metaphysical knowledge with the argument that certain universal and necessary conditions are involved in having experience and describing it. With these conditions, it is possible to have genuine knowledge about the forms of all possible experience, space and time, and about the categories in which all experience is described. If one tries to apply these categories beyond possible experience, that will lead to contradictions and skepticism. As a result, it is not possible to know about things in themselves or about the ultimate causes of experience. John Georg Hamann, another skeptic critical of Kant, saw a new basis for fideism in Hume's and Kant's work. If knowledge of reality cannot be gained by rational means, then one must turn to faith. Based on Hume's work, Hamann advanced anti-rational skepticism in an unsuccessful effort to convince Kant to become a fideistic Christian. Hamann's fideism was also developed in France by Catholic opponents to the French Revolution. We will now talk about the 19th century to present. Existentialism. In the 19th century, irrational skepticism was developed into existentialism, which is a school of philosophy that emphasizes the concrete and problematic character of human existence. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard stressed the need for faith. Only by a leap into faith could certainty be found, which would be completely subjective rather than objective. Theologians who came later, influenced by existentialism, argued that the challenge of skepticism highlights humanity's inability to find any ultimate truth except through faith and commitment. Non-religious forms of this view were developed in the 20th century by writers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They believed that the rational and scientific examination of the world shows it to be unintelligible and absurd. And if God is dead, as Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed, then the world is ultimately meaningless. Yet it is necessary to struggle with it. It is then through action and commitment that one finds whatever personal meaning one can, though it has no objective significance. Idealism and naturalism. English idealist F. H. Bradley used classical skeptical arguments in his 1893 essay called Appearance and Reality, a metaphysical essay, to argue that the world cannot be understood empirically or materialistically. True knowledge can be reached only by transcending the world of appearance. American philosopher George Santayana, in his work called Skepticism and Animal Faith, written in 1923, presented a naturalistic skepticism. Any interpretation of immediate experience is open to question. To make life meaningful, people interpret their experiences on the basis of animal faith, according to biological and social factors. The resulting beliefs, which are probably unjustified and based on illusion, enable them to persevere and to find meaning in their lives. Logical positivism. Skepticism also appeared in 20th century logical positivism and linguistic philosophy. The attack on speculative metaphysics, developed by Ernst Mach, Bertrand Russell, and Rudolf Kamak, incorporated a skepticism about the possibility of gaining knowledge of anything other than mere logical redundancy. Russell and Karl Popper further stressed the principle of induction, and Popper criticized theories of knowledge based upon empirical verification. Fritz Mossner, who helped found linguistic analysis, began teaching a type of skepticism according to which there are no objective connections between language and the world. Word meaning in a language is relative to its users and therefore subjective. Every attempt to determine what is true leads back to linguistic formulations, not to objective states of affairs. The result is a complete skepticism about reality, a reality that cannot be expressed except in terms that Mossner called godless mystical contemplation. Moore and Wittgenstein. Cambridge philosopher G. E. Moore brought forth a different way of dealing with skepticism. He believed that no matter how compelling skeptical arguments may be, they cannot undermine the certain knowledge that people have of basic propositions such as the earth has existed for a long time. This kind of certain knowledge can be a foundation for other knowledge claims, even though there may be some highly unusual circumstances in which it could be questioned. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his late work on certainty, which was published in 1969, after his passing, looked at this kind of resolution, though he rejected Moore's characterization of that which is certain as a kind of knowledge. For Wittgenstein, certainty lay in the ways human beings act in their forms of life. Philosophers in this same period continued to argue about what constitutes knowledge and whether there can be a kind of certain knowledge that is immune to skeptical doubt. Postmodernism is a new and radical form of skepticism that emerged in the last half of the 20th century. This view questions whether there can be any rational, objective framework for discussing intellectual problems, or whether instead the intellectual frameworks that people use are essentially determined by their life situations. Postmodernism undermined confidence in the validity of any kind of human investigation of the world by showing that such an investigation itself would need to be investigated. Postmodernists saw philosophy and science merely as activities, which were to be judged in terms of their roles in or effects on human societies, rather than by some transcendent standard of truth or falsehood. Psychologists and sociologists who were sympathetic to postmodernism stressed how intellectual frameworks vary according to sexual orientation, race, gender, and other features of human identity. Critics of postmodernism viewed it as confused and having a harmful effect. We will now talk about the problem of criterion. The problem of criterion is an issue that helps to shed some light on the issues between skeptic and the non-skeptic. This problem deals with two related questions dealing with knowledge. What is the extent of our knowledge? Or what do we know? And what are the criteria of knowing? What conditions must be satisfied in order to know something? If we had a solid answer to one of these questions, we would have an easy way of attempting to figure out the answer to the other. If we were sure of the criteria of knowledge, we would be able to figure out which specific things satisfied those criteria and thereby determine the extent of our knowledge. If we are not able to answer either of these questions, then it is hard to see on what basis the answer to either of them could be. Roderick Chisholm, an American philosopher, distinguishes two main responses. A generalist begins with intuitively determined criteria of knowledge and seeks to determine on that basis which specific beliefs are cases of knowledge. A particularist begins with particular instances of belief that constitute knowledge and then seeks to generalize from them to the correct general criteria of knowledge. The challenge of skepticism. The challenges raised by early skeptics, men such as Gorgias and Protagoras, did not have a determining effect upon the greatest of ancient thinkers, Aristotle and Plato. Both Aristotle and Plato thought skepticism was self-defeating. In Theaetetus, Plato argued that the skeptic's claim, "No knowledge is possible for human beings," referred also to itself, as to all claims to knowledge. However, if that claim is true, it must then be false, since it asserts at least one proposition as knowledge, the proposition of skepticism itself. But Plato's clever counter-argument does not settle the questions raised by the skeptical challenge. It only claims that skepticism fails as a theory of knowledge, as indeed it would have to. A theory cannot account for what it says does not exist. Skepticism just points to logical difficulties essential to the idea of justified knowledge. I will now give an example of this. The first is a very common tree in the forest. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? There are two problems with this question. Justification is the first problem. If no one with ears is in the forest when the tree falls, then we have no way to put the matter to the test. If someone was around, that person would have heard the tree fall. But that response raises the question of what happens when no one is there. If you put a tape recorder in the forest, that would not help, even if you played the sound back, because the tape recorder did not hear the sound. It just recorded the sound waves as electromagnetic impulses. The skeptic would say that we do not have sufficient grounds for the belief that the tree makes a sound when it falls. The scientific account of hearing the falling tree is that the falling tree causes transverse waves to form in the air. When these waves enter an ear, it causes vibrations to be transformed into electrochemical impulses that result in the perception of a crashing sound by the person listening. Other than that, there is no sound, although there are sound waves. Given this account of hearing and sound, the skeptic has a second challenge. There are times when we hear sounds that are not really there, as with a hearing impairment, and because of this, it is possible that when we judge a tree to be falling because of what we hear, the cause of the sound is something internal to our ears, and no tree is actually falling. The mere possibility that an internal event triggers the sound cannot be eliminated. This can cause us to wonder if the tree falling actually made a sound. If we saw a tree fall, we may really be hearing sounds internal to our ears and incorrectly projecting them beyond our hearing apparatus and onto the falling tree. To investigate the cause, we must always examine both the cause and the effect. But in this situation, we can only examine the effect, the sound that we hear. We are not able to examine the sound apart from the hearing of it. To do that, we would have to go outside of our capacity of hearing sound, to the sounds as they are apart from our hearing them. The skeptic says that we cannot do that. Illusions. If we agree that the senses give us access to a real world of physical objects, the reliability of the access may be questioned. The access itself may distort the image of what we see. When we wear glasses, it distorts the image of what we would see without the glasses. Seeing a bent pencil, when a pencil extends out of a clear glass of water, appears to be cut at the point of its exit from the water, is actually the refraction of the light that has deceived our senses. This is an example of what kinds of tricks nature may play and may result in our seeing things differently than what and how they really are. Our senses may trick us. If we show a source of knowledge to be unreliable, the skeptics say we must always doubt whether it is reliable in any given instance. If perception is the only possible source of knowledge, especially if all other thinking is based upon it, then knowledge in general is not possible. Dreaming is another example of illusions and perceiving objects. If someone dreams of being a bird, and the dream is so vivid the dreamer does not know if he is dreaming or if it is actually happening, he is immersed in the content of his dream as deeply as he is when he is awake. We can never be certain that what we perceive is more real than a dream image. Responses to skepticism. Moore's response to skepticism puts too much weight on the common sense intuition and therefore illegitimately rules out the very possibility of skepticism. As a result, Moore's answer to skepticism will be unacceptable to anyone who takes skepticism seriously. Another response is the program of naturalized epistemology. When taken in its strong form, that in which it constitutes a real alternative to traditional epistemology, naturalized epistemology seems to acknowledge everything that the skeptic wants and avoids this appearance only by changing the subject. The third response I will talk about here is the traditional Cartesian epistemology. This response tries to answer the skeptic head-on by arguing that beliefs about the external world are justified because they are rationally preferable to skeptical hypotheses. Criticism. In Western philosophy, skepticism raises basic epistemological issues. It has questioned whether it is possible to determine which human experiences are truthful. The different perceptions of what is presumed to be one object raises the question of which view is correct. Illusory experiences raises the question of whether it is really possible to distinguish illusions and dreams from reality. The criteria used can be questioned and require justification. Some critics of skepticism have argued that it is a weak view, both logically and humanly. Any attempt to formulate the position is self-refuting because it will involve at least some knowledge claims about what is supposed to be uncertain. Hume said skepticism may be self-refuting, but in the process of refuting itself, it undermines dogmatism. Sextus said, skepticism is like a purge that eliminates itself as well as everything else. Other critics believe that anyone who tried to be a complete skeptic, denying all judgments about ordinary beliefs, would be driven insane. Even Hume thought that a complete skeptic would end up starving to death, or walking into walls, or out of windows. On the flip side, Sextus argued that skepticism is a form of mental health. Instead of going crazy, the skeptic can function better than the dogmatist. Skepticism throughout history has played an important role in forcing dogmatic philosophers to find better or stronger bases for their views. It has demanded a re-examination of previous knowledge claims and has stimulated creative thinkers to work out new theories to meet skeptical problems. Some may say the history of philosophy can be seen as a struggle with skepticism. The attacks on the skeptic has also served as a check on speculation. A lot of modern thinkers have been sufficiently affected by skepticism. They have sought ways of living with unresolved skeptical problems through various forms of naturalistic, scientific, or religious faiths. This concludes my presentation on skepticism. It is my hope you learned something new, and that what you learned will help you look at things a little differently than before. Thank you for listening.